Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever time of day this finds you. I hope you're having a good one. Today we're going to talk about preparing for the MCAT. And I'm going to discuss techniques that I use with my medical students as I'm preparing them for their board exams. Because like the COMLEX or USMLE, the MCAT is an assessment that is designed to gauge a student's ability to retain a large variety of material across an entire curriculum. So this is not necessarily a study technique that is going to be beneficial for small quizzes or exams on concentrated topics, though some of the technique part of it is useful for that. This is really made for those type of examinations that are curriculum spanning. I am fortunate that I work with an absolutely amazing academic support specialist whose graduate degree is actually focused on developing techniques for students for different types of assessments. And so she has worked with me on this as well, and together we've kind of refined this technique and have had quite a bit of success with our medical students as they prepare for boards, and even some of our undergraduate and graduate students that go on to take the MCAT. So hopefully what you'll find is that this is a technique that will work for you and you can employ it as well. So I divide this technique into three phases. Phase one is an identification and organization phase. So as we go into it, we'll see that we want to look for sources and organize those sources. Phase two is designed to assess your current level of readiness for the exam. And then not until phase three do we actually get into the actual studying for the exam. Now phase one, like I said, this is a identification and survey phase. And we're going to use this phase to address the common mistake number one that students make. And that is to jump right into studying without organizing what you're studying. So you know that you have to take this test, you know there's a lot of information on it, so you just start studying, but you don't have any type of direction to your studying. And I always like to akin this to going on a backpacking trip. If you decide you're going to go on a backpacking trip, you don't just strap on a backpack and walk out into the woods. Before you go, you're going to look at a map, you're going to decide your route, you're going to load your backpack, figure out what supplies you need, and these first two phases of studying for the MCAT are doing just that. We don't want to study until we're prepared to study. So this first phase, that is a survey phase, what we want to do is first identify a reliable source of topics and study materials. Now this is where those MCAT Prep courses come in handy because they often do that work for you. Now the prep courses themselves I am not a great fan of because they're kind of designed as a one-size-fits-all, and they kind of throw every student into this regimented coursework that lasts 4 weeks or 8 weeks or however long. But as you see what I do at the end here and talk about the actual study, and you'll see why I don't like those types of programs. But the one thing that they all do very well is that they identify the topics that are on the MCAT, and they put out, in most cases, very good practice questions, very good practice exams, and good brief study materials that get to the point. So if you can get that study material and self-study, you're probably better off than you are actually taking the course. And so we want to do that. So as soon as you can do that, get the topics that you want. The nice thing about the MCAT is it doesn't change a great deal from year to year. And so if you have a friend who took the MCAT last year, grab their materials if they bought some study materials. You'll probably have to buy your own practice exams or practice questions because those banks expire. But for the materials themselves, if they're a year old, that's going to work just fine because, like I said, the MCAT doesn't change a great deal. So get them secondhand, but make sure you look them over first, that they're in a style that you can easily navigate through, because even though the content is very similar, the presentation of them is different, whether you choose Kaplan or Princeton Review or Falcon or any of the other ones that are out there. Once you identify that source, what we want to do is then organize it into manageable study topics. And these study topics are going to be fairly narrow, so we don't want broad study topics. So for example, organic chemistry is not a good study topic because it's too broad. there are many subtopics within organic chemistry, some that you might be very good at, some that you may not be very good at. And so we want to get them into fairly precise topics. So for example, SN1 and SN2 reactions, that's a topic. Nomenclature is a topic. Those types of things, that's the level of topic that we're looking at. And so once we get our material, we want to divide the material into those small topics. And once we do that, then we're done with phase 1 because we have it all set out. Phase 2 is an evaluation phase, and there are 2 parts to phase 2. The first one is a qualitative evaluation phase. And so one thing to keep in mind, this is a evaluation, not studying. So even though we're going to be going through the material in phase 2, we're not actually attempting to study it. Now we will get some more comprehension of our material as we go through it during this phase, but that's not the goal. That's just a side effect of reading through the material. So what we want to do is take our small sections and then just line them up and read through each one of them. We're not rereading, we're just going to read through every section once, and at the end of that section we're going to ask ourselves a simple yes/no question. Do I understand it? Not am I ready to take a test on it, simply do I understand it? Does this concept make sense as I read it? You don't want to spend a lot of time on this. This is just a brief pass through, yes or no, fill in your column. It doesn't matter how many yeses you have, how many no's you have. What matters is that you're going to be honest with yourself and you're going to be critical with yourself as you get through it. The next part of phase 2 is a quantitative evaluation. So we're going to do the same thing that we just did with the qualitative yes/no, but now we want to evaluate the level of yes or the level of no. And so again, we're still not studying this material, but as we go through it, we want to be a little bit more critical of ourselves as to the level of what we understand it. So we want to assign everything a numerical ranking, where 1 are things that you just simply do not understand the concepts at all. So obviously these are the things that you have the lowest amount of aptitude towards. And then a 10, these are the things that you fully understand the material, you would be comfortable teaching this material to somebody, and in fact you'd be okay taking an exam on the material right then or with very, very little review of the material. Once we do that, then we're going to have a number assigned to every piece of material that we have, every topic that we have, from 1 to 10, and then we're going to be ready to enter phase 3. So this is where we're going to start studying in phase 3. And we're simply going to line up our topics from 1 to 10. So the x-axis on this chart here would be the time. Notice I don't have a timeline here because that's going to be different for everybody. Some people are going to be able to devote 8 to 10 hours a day studying, and so it's not going to take them as long to prepare for the MCAT chronologically. Some people either don't have the attention span, and that's fine, or you simply don't have the time to devote that much time in a day. Maybe you have to work, or you have to do something else where your time is taken away from you so that you can't devote a large amount of time. It doesn't matter, because if you do this technique right, it shouldn't matter how long it takes you to get from one end to the next of it. And so what we're going to do is organize our topics from 1 to 10, and we're going to start studying our weakest topics first. And so we're going to start studying with the 1s, and we're going to go through all of our 1s. And then when we're done with that, we're going to circle back around and we're going to start all over and we're going to study all of our 1s again, but then we're going to add our 2s onto the end of it. And then when we're done with that, again, we're going to study our 1s again, add our 2s, and then add our 3s. And we're going to continue to do this all the way down until eventually our last couple of passes of the material, we're going to start with our 1s, get to our 2s, and we're going to keep going right through to our 10s. And so what this does is that over our time, going from one point in time to the next, what we're going to see is that we study the material that we're the weakest at for the longest amount of time, and we're going to have the most passes through it. We're going to study the material that we are the strongest at the least number of times, and only right before the exam. So for example, these 10s, I always like to give the example of the cell cycle. I have a PhD in biochemistry. I understand the cell cycle. But if you ask me right now what happens in anaphase, I honestly couldn't tell you. But if you told me I had an exam that question might be asked, I'd look it over, but I wouldn't look it over until I get to that area. So something like that is going to be a 9 or a 10 for me, and so there's no point in me studying that way at the beginning of my time period, 3 or 4 months before I actually take the exam. I want to wait on that until I just need to refresh my memory before the exam. Whereas with all of this other material, these 1s and 2s, things that I don't really understand that well, that's the material that I need to have the repetition. I may not improve my ability at it here, not even much here, but by the time I get over here, my 1s and 2s, my knowledge level of them become 5s and 6s, which is the place where you actually gain your points on the MCAT, is by improving your weakest areas to be middle areas. You're not going to get any better at your 9s and 10s before the exam. You just want to make sure you don't miss the points. Now, while you're doing this, the entire time that you are studying these materials, you're going to take periodic breaks and you're going to do practice questions. So this is pretty important to do practice questions. And so even when you're in this block where you're only studying your 1s, you're still doing practice questions on all of this material here. And the reason for that is because you may not be getting these questions right because you haven't studied them, but by the time you start studying the 4s and the 5s, you'll have seen several rounds of practice questions that address them. And so when you get to that material, it's going to help reinforce some of that information, because you'll be studying the material and you say, oh, I remember this question from when I took a practice exam a couple of weeks ago. And so now you start to get a feel for the level of depth that you have to look at the material, and you start to be able to get to the point where you can anticipate the questions that can come from various segments of material based on the type of questions you've seen about it before when you're taking these practice questions. And that brings me to the common mistake number 2 that students make, and that is getting frustrated with your weaker topics and jumping ahead to your stronger material. And this is a bad idea simply because it takes you away from the place where you have the most points to gain on the MCAT, especially if you've taken it before. So the way this usually goes is you start looking at material that you're struggling with, and as you struggle with it, you are getting frustrated and you think, you know what, I'm going to put off the general physics for today and I'm going to look at general biology because I'm good at it and it's going to make me feel a little bit better and I'm going to get over the frustration and I'll come back to physics tomorrow. The problem with that is that you keep doing it and eventually tomorrow never comes, and you get to the point where all of a sudden you're 2 weeks outside of the exam and you haven't studied for your 1s and your 2s and your 4s and your 5s, and so you make this decision, well, I'm not going to be able to get that, so I'm just going to take my lumps on organic chemistry or my lumps with physics, and I'm going to try to maximize my points with biology. The problem is, if this is a topic that you've already been an 8 at, maybe in a couple of weeks you can elevate yourself to a 10, but that's not a lot of gain in the number of points that you can get. Whereas with a 1, if you can just bump a 1 up to a 5, all of a sudden you're really helping your score out, because these areas that were weaker are having much more substantial jumps than the areas that are stronger. So even though that 1 might become a 5, it's still not going to be as good for you as the 8 was. the gain that you've got here was a lot better than the gain that you got here, and so your total score is going to be higher. Because I promise you, when admissions committees are looking at your MCAT scores, they'd much rather see a 508 with a bunch of pretty good scores than, say, a 502 with one really good section and then a couple of middling sections. Right, so you want to maximize that overall score. That overall MCAT score is going to be much more important than those individual topics, especially since you can't maximize them as much as you think you can maximize them. Okay, so that is the study technique. It's not really all that involved. It's not any breakthrough, but it is something that if you have an organized plan from start to finish, you can do much, much better on the MCAT than you would just jumping into it. If you want to talk about anything else about your med school app, like I've said to a bunch of people on Twitter, I have been doing this for 20 years. I've been on admissions committees at 4 different medical schools and a pharmacy school. I'd be more than happy to talk with you about what admissions committees generally look at in your application and to help you make your application look as strong as you can. Just drop me an email, or if you're on Twitter, I'm at BC Biochemist is my Twitter handle. Go ahead and make contact with me there. Hope you have a good MCAT when you do take it, and hope to run into you in medical school someday. Have a good afternoon.